Winning Blueprint presents.
In the lab room. Seattle Seahawks.
Mr. Wilson! Oh, Russell Wilson! To me, the Seattle Seahawks seem like Dennis the Menace. Even though they had Mr. Wilson, they had Russell Wilson, they just seem like Dennis the Menace in that division. Because the 49ers, they seemed like Mr. Wilson. They were the adults. And even though both of these teams are relatively young, the 49ers had been there. They had done that. They went to the NFC Championship game a year ago. They got close to going to the Super Bowl and really getting it done. And so they were the leaders in the clubhouse in the NFC West. They were the ones everyone was chasing, looking up to. And here comes the Seattle Seahawks, these young punks. And you knew Mr. Wilson. He's not afraid of Dennis. Okay, Mr. Wilson is afraid of Dennis. But he's an adult, and if he needed something to be done, he could do it. But he's still afraid of Dennis because Dennis can cause so much havoc. And that's how I felt about the Seattle Seahawks. The 49ers never really wanted any part of the Seattle Seahawks because they knew the damage that this team could do. I mean, we don't need to look any further than that last matchup between these two teams at the end of the season to know that this Seattle Seahawks team was dangerous. And the 49ers knew that, and they really didn't want any part of them. So I thought that the Seattle Seahawks, if given the right platform, could have been one of the most dangerous teams in the National Football League. And with that being said, I am your host, Lou. Thank you for joining me on the lab follow-up for the 2015 to select in the 2013 draft, the Seattle Seahawks. Now, we'll be talking Seahawks football today, their 2012 journey as they were able to get to the divisional round of the postseason before being knocked off by the Atlanta Falcons. They had one heck of a season, and there was one game in particular that you circle on their schedule and say that was a turning point. If you're a Seahawks fan, you know exactly what I'm referring to. For those of you who are not Seahawks fans, I'll tell you exactly what game that was a little bit later in the program. But let's talk about this season, this team, where they started, where they ended up, how they got there, and what they need to do moving forward to become even better than they were in 2012. So you look at this Seattle Seahawks team, and from the outside looking in when this season started, I saw a solid football team that could run the football, coached by a very electric and energetic coach in Pete Carroll. And in the offseason, in the preseason, he kind of threw us a curveball. We thought that they went out and acquired Matt Flynn for him to be the starter. They draft Russell Wilson. No one really knows what they have in store for Russell Wilson. We just know they drafted him with a third-round selection. And so we're thinking, hey, that's nice, a nice little solid backup. Their new cynical Wallace, if you will. No. Pete Carroll puts him on the field, and he performs in the preseason so well that Pete Carroll says, hey, you're my starter. And they had some ups and downs, some bumps and some bruises early on in this season, did the Seattle Seahawks. But you could see the promise and potential for this team because defensively, they were holding it down. I mean, you weren't scoring a lot of points on this defense, and you said to yourself, if this offense ever comes around, ever catches up to the intensity that this defense plays with, this is going to be a scary team. Because even though they lost that opener to Arizona on the road, it's a divisional game. It's a tough opponent. Russell Wilson took this team down the field, and there were some questionable no calls in that game at the end that allowed the Arizona Cardinals to hold on. But he took his team down the field, did Russell Wilson, and so you said, hey, I see the makings of a young quarterback that can really give teams fits in this league if he can continue to mature at a solid rate in his rookie season. Now, there were some real duds in that mix early on. I mean, that St. Louis game by far was his worst game of the season. And Russell Wilson was pretty steady all year long. But that was the one game where you said, hey, he's showing the fact that he's a rookie. I think he threw 3 or 4 interceptions in that game. If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was 3. They lost on the road to a Rams team that's solid defensively. Don't let the Rams record fool you. This was a very solid defensive ball club, whereas the St. Louis Rams. And so they ran into a St. Louis Rams team that was getting after the quarterback at that time, and he was forced into some mistakes. He turned the football over, but that was as bad as it got for him in the season. After that loss, the Seahawks were up and down. They had a dominant performance against the Cowboys early on in the season. They had some really solid games moving forward after that Rams loss, but they never could really string together a huge winning streak. They could never really get where they wanted to be in the season. They'd win 2, they'd lose 1, they'd win another, then lose 2, and then they got to 6-6. That was the crossroads in their season. They got to 6-6. They had a tough one on the road against the Chicago Bears team that was struggling to score points, but they were playing really good football at home especially. They hadn't started their slide yet, had the Chicago Bears, and so this looked like a loss on the schedule for the Seattle Seahawks. This didn't look like a winnable game. And as we all know, the Seahawks had won every game so far at home, but they were a terrible, lousy team on the road. We know the replacement refs gave them a game against the Green Bay Packers. And so you could argue that this team shouldn't have even been 6-6 at the time. And their struggles on the road led you to believe this was not a postseason ready team. This was a team that was probably going to win every home game that they had on their schedule, but only win 1, maybe 2 games on the road, and that wouldn't be enough for them to get into the postseason. That's what it looked like at the time when they were 6-6 heading to Chicago. That would all change against the Chicago Bears as the Seattle Seahawks went into Soldier Field and they hung around. They just played a very, very tough, gritty game. They just hung around. They hung in there. They hung in there. The Bears could not put them away. They had opportunities, but the Bears could not put this Seattle Seahawks team away. And Russell Wilson took his team on a 10, 11 play, 96-yard drive down the field for a touchdown that gave them the lead late in this football game. And it looked like the Seattle Seahawks were going to come into Chicago and steal one. Absolutely burglarize the Chicago Bears at home. And then the Seahawks showed something that would come back to haunt them later on in this season. The inability to close out a football game with less than a minute to go, as the Seattle Seahawks allowed Jay Cutler to complete about a 55, 60-yard pass to Brandon Marshall and get out of bounds, setting up a Robbie Gould field goal to send this thing to overtime. No worries if you're a Seattle Seahawks fan, as Russell Wilson and the Seattle Seahawks won the opening toss in overtime, took the football down the field, scored a touchdown, ended the game right there on the spot as they were able to beat the Chicago Bears 23-17 in overtime for a huge road victory. In winning that football game, the Seahawks continued on a torrid pace to finish this season up, winning their final 7 out of 8 games, getting to 11-5 on the season, clinching a postseason berth. And really, the whole NFC was so thankful that this team did not get home field advantage. Had this team started off the season a bit stronger, won 12 games, got the 2nd seed in the NFC, I don't think that this team would have lost in the postseason. Especially being that the number 1 seeded Atlanta Falcons ended up losing before the championship game, which would have meant Seattle would have had a chance to host that championship game. So that's the platform that I was referring to early on when I said things could have been different if this team would have had the right platform. That platform is CenturyLink Field. If they're at home, Seattle is almost unbeatable. Now, there's no given, there's no certainties in the National Football League, But one that you could count on in 2012 in the National Football League was that if Seattle was at home, they were going to win. If you were on the road in Seattle, you were leaving with a loss. Not many things you could guarantee in the 2012 season. That was one of them. This team was lights out at home. And they were a physical bunch at home. More so than they were on the road. They were a different team at home, were the Seattle Seahawks. I mean, one of the games that stood out for me, and a lot of people won't talk about this game, wasn't a huge game. It turned out to be huge in the standings later on because this was a team that made the postseason in the Minnesota Vikings. But at the time, it looked like two teams that were going to be middle of the pack that weren't going to really threaten to make the postseason, but they were going to be around at the end, and this game could have playoff implications. Well, the game against the Minnesota Vikings at home, to me, for my money, the most physical game I watched all season long. These teams were colliding with each other, and all game long it was like two car crashes. Every time somebody touched the ball, the other person was trying to take the other one's head off. Percy Harvin left this game with a concussion, didn't return all season long, and it was because this game was so physical. And that's what the Seahawks did when they played against San Francisco in San Francisco on that Monday night matchup. Physical football game. One that I thought Russell Wilson actually played pretty well in. He didn't get any help. Guys were dropping the ball. Evan Moore had a costly drop. Guys were dropping the football left and right in this game. He didn't get help. And so they lost that football game. But they made it to the postseason with an 11-5 mark, went on the road to take on the Redskins in Wild Card Weekend, fell to the Redskins 14-0 to start this game in the first quarter, but they were able to persevere, bounce back. They were aided by the injury to Robert Griffin III, but nonetheless, they smelled blood in the water. They attacked. They started to settle down. They ran the football well in that game, and they were able to get the victory by scoring 24 unanswered points on the road after trailing 14-0. That's the mark of a really solid football team. Well coached. They stayed the course, ran off 24 straight, won on the road 24-14 to advance to the divisional round of the postseason. This was going to be a tougher task, however, as they were playing the number 1 seed in the NFC in the Atlanta Falcons in the Georgia Dome. This was going to be a very raucous crowd. Now, the Seahawks went on the road to the number 1 overall seed and did the one thing that I said they couldn't afford to do in this game when talking about them in a preview for that game, which was fall behind early. I said, you can't do what you did against Washington and think you're going to get away with it 2 weeks in a row, because the Redskins suffered a catastrophic injury that allowed you to come from behind and take that football game. Without that injury, I don't know if the outcome is the same. Maybe the Seahawks still rally and win that game. I don't know. But against the Falcons, on the road, a team that can score points, you're not going to fall behind and think you're just going to waltz back into that game and walk away with the victory. And they fell behind 20-0 in this game. And at one point, it was 27-7 in the fourth quarter. Down 20 points, 3 touchdowns. And I was wrong. The Seahawks roared back. They scored 21 unanswered points to take a 28-27 lead with less than a minute to go in the football game. But remember, I had told you earlier on against the Bears, something that would come back to haunt this Seattle Seahawks team came back and bit them in the rear once more. And this time, it was the kiss of death for their season. The inability to stop a team with less than a minute to go and secure a lead. For as good as this defense has been all season long, and we're talking about the 4th overall ranked defense in the National Football League in the 2012 season. For as good as they were defensively, they had issues covering and stopping teams from going down and getting points to end football games. And as good as their corners talk and boast and proclaim to be, for them to give up plays at the end of the game, no excuse for it. And again, this Seattle Seahawks team allowed the Falcons to go right down the field after taking the lead and looking like they were heading to the championship game to take on those same 49ers. The Seattle Seahawks allowed Matt Ryan to orchestrate a last-second drive, putting them in field goal range for Matt Bryant, who knocks it home, sending the Seattle Seahawks home with a 30-28 loss in the divisional round of the postseason. And so it was a remarkable season for the Seahawks, a great ride, but it could have been better. It could have went further. It could have ended in hoisting a Lombardi trophy. But the defense and their inability to get a stop when it matters most cost this team in the end. So you look at this team and what they were able to accomplish in 2012, and it was a dynamite season for the Seattle Seahawks. 11-5 after being 6-5 at one point and really getting to a crossroads in their season. They were able to withstand, and I believe earlier I said they were 6-6. They were 6-5, and they got to a crossroads in their season and were able to really rally, beat the Bears, and I think that did a number of things for this team, including confidence that they could get it done anywhere, road, at home, and they just had the confidence that they could beat anyone, and they played like it down the stretch. So you look at this team in the offseason and what they need to do to improve. Of course, when you're a good football team like the Seahawks were in 2012, teams are going to come calling about your coordinator. So the Seattle Seahawks, just like many teams who make the playoffs, have a successful season, have hot coordinators, lost one of their coordinators, Gus Bradley, to the Jacksonville Jaguars as he's their new head coach. So they had to replace him. And the Seattle Seahawks did not waste any time in doing just that. Simultaneously, as Gus Bradley was being announced as the Jacksonville Jaguars head coach, the Seattle Seahawks was hiring Dan Quinn as their new defensive coordinator, the ex-defensive coordinator from the Florida Gators. So the Seahawks aren't wasting any time. They're making sure that they're on top of things in Seattle. They don't want any change from what they did defensively in the 2012 season. Of course, they would like to be a lot more stout at the end of ball games, but this was one of the most dominant defenses in the league. We're talking about ranked defense in the National Football League. Okay, this team got it done defensively, and they had 36 sacks. That's a solid number. That's not a great number, but when you're getting the kind of coverage that you're getting outside, it really doesn't matter, and it always helps. I would assure you, and I'm guessing, I don't know this for sure, that a third of their sacks came off of coverage sacks because their coverage was so good down the field that their guys were allowed to rush after the passer just a tad bit longer. But nonetheless, a third of them probably came from coverage sacks, and a third of them probably came in that game against Green Bay. They were dominant in that game. But looking at this defense, I want to talk about the defense first, moving forward. I think that this defense, they're young, they're hungry, they're talented. There's a lot to like about this Seattle Seahawks defense. The only area that they need to become, I guess, even younger would be defensive line, I guess. And Bruce Irvin gave you 8 sacks, their first-round pick out of West Virginia, the rush specialist. So you have a guy there that's the future of your defensive line. You could use more help on that defensive line. Chris Clemens gave you 11.5 sacks, but he just tore his ACL. You don't know what you're getting back. And again, Chris Clemens, over 30 years old. So you don't know what Chris Clemens you're going to get moving forward. So you can use some more depth along that defensive line, but at linebacker, you are set as set can get in the National Football League. I love KJ Wright, and I think one of the most talented players to come out in the last year's draft that no one's really talking about is Bobby Wagner, your middle linebacker. This guy was all over the field. And so the Seahawks are set at linebacker for years to come. And you're looking at secondary. We don't even need to talk about the secondary. We know what this secondary is. We know about Brandon Brown. We know about Richard Sherman. We know about Cam Chancellor. We know about Earl Thomas. The Seahawks have one of the most dominant secondaries in all of the National Football League, top to bottom. We're talking about guys that could be going to the Pro Bowl for the next 5 years easy. They're that solid at their secondary position. And so the Seahawks are basically set on defense. Again, some pieces here, some pieces there along that defensive line. And I think the Seahawks defense will pick up right where they left off if Dan Quinn can get these guys to buy into what he wants them to do and also continue to do some of the things that they did a season ago. You look at the offense. This offense was 17th in the National Football League. Really, it doesn't do them justice. This ranking doesn't do the Seattle Seahawks offense any justice because they started slow. They babysat Russell Wilson in the early part of the season. Really didn't want him to push the issue. Didn't want to push the envelope with him. Didn't want to give him too much. I think that's exactly how you want to work your quarterback in. If you're not going to allow him to sit on the sideline and watch and learn, then at least spoon feed him. Give him little amounts of the playbook. Give him small spoonfuls to allow him to acclimate himself into the NFL game, the speed, the playbook, all the looks and the different reads that he's going to have to make. Give it to him in small increments. And I think that's what the Seahawks did throughout this season until they got to the end when they realized we can unleash everything. Now, this guy gets it. He understands what he can and can't do. 26 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, over 3,000 yards passing. That will get it done every single time in the National Football League, veteran or rookie. And so Russell Wilson was one of the most impressive rookies in all of the National Football League, and he had this offense playing at a high level, a very high level. Toward the end of the season, this team was scoring up over 50 points, seemed like routinely at the end of the season, and so they really brought him along, I think, the way that you need to. But look, everyone isn't afforded the type of running game that Russell Wilson and the Seattle Seahawks were in the 2012 season. Not everyone has a beast mode like Marshawn Lynch. Not everyone has the third best rushing attack in the National Football League like the Seattle Seahawks did. Not everyone can say we own a 1,500-yard rusher like the Seattle Seahawks did. So it's hard for me to sit here and say, yeah, this is the way you bring your quarterback along. Most teams that has a rookie quarterback starting doesn't have a top 5 defense and a top 5 running game to go along with their rookie quarterback. So it's easier said than done. It's one thing when you have the defense and the running game to really supplement that quarterback and allow him to come along slowly. And it's a totally different thing when you're the Indianapolis Colts and your defense is 26th in the league and you can't run the football. You're averaging 3.8 yards a carry. And so your quarterback has to shoulder the burden. That's not what the Seahawks asked of Russell Wilson, and I think it really benefited them later on in the season. So moving forward in the 2013 season for the Seattle Seahawks, it's really simple. Can you duplicate what you were able to do and able to accomplish in 2013? Can you duplicate what you did in 2012 into the next season and moving on? I mean, this team is built to contend year in and year out. Will they? Is the question. Will Russell Wilson continue to get better, or will he regress, or will he just stay at the level that he played at last year? We saw him progress at the end of the season. That last game that they lost against the Falcons, he threw for over 400 yards. This is a quarterback that up until that game hadn't thrown for over 300 all season long. So that lets you know he's seeing the field, he's understanding what the defenses are trying to do to him, and he's understanding how to pick them apart. This offense can grow exponentially with Russell Wilson at the helm if they continue to do the things that they've done. This team didn't have a huge number 1 receiver. They did it as a collective group. Sidney Rice, you look at Golden Tate, and it's funny because their leading receiver a year ago was Doug Baldwin. And so you get a multitude of receivers coming your way. None of these guys had over 800 yards receiving. Nobody had over 50 catches on this team. But they got it done as a collective group, and that's what makes this Seattle Seahawks team dangerous. There's not one guy you can focus on or take away to make this offense go stagnant. They have many weapons, and Russell Wilson knows how to use them all. So if they can continue to run the football, if they can continue to develop this passing game, this team is going to be dangerous. I think all that they're missing is a change of pace from Marshawn Lynch, and they really like what they saw out of their pick last year, Robert Turbin out of Utah State. I like what I saw out of Robert Turbin. And so if they can continue to get steady progress from these young guys, this team is going to be very dangerous. And offensively, it's hard for me to really think of many positions that they need help at. You look at the receiver position, they go 3-4 deep there. You look at the tight end position, they go 2-3 deep there. The offensive line, that was a revelation in 2012. Guys started to play at their potential. We saw what the Seahawks were looking for from Russell Okung when they drafted him. He made it to his first Pro Bowl. They saw a lot out of their center, Max Unger. He made it to a Pro Bowl. And so they're getting a lot out of their offensive line now. And so tell you what, the Seahawks continue to do what they're doing. Moving guys like J.R. Sweezy from defense to the offensive line and getting him to work. You keep doing things like that, this Seattle Seahawks team will be one of the most dangerous teams moving forward. So you look at this team drafting 25th, and you say, what could you use? Really hard pressed to look at one area and say that's an area of need. But if I had to pick one, I say you go defensive line once again. Red Bryant, he's a beast. You look at Bruce Irvin, he's a little undersized, a little light in the pants. You could use another guy like Chris Clemens, who's getting up there in age. As insurance, you need more depth along that defensive line. So if I had to pick one area, I'd say that's the one you need to focus in on. You got a guy like John Ryan as your punter. You don't have many issues on this team, not many holes to fill. So if I were the Seattle Seahawks, just keep going along the same path that you've been traveling on these last couple of seasons. And sky's the limit for this team. And that'll do it for the Seattle Seahawks here on the Lab Follow-Up. I thank you for joining me. Come back on Monday when we'll be talking about the Green Bay Packers, as they are the 26th team to select in the upcoming 2013 draft. Thank you for joining me here on the Lab Follow-Up for the Seattle Seahawks. See you next time. Thank you. Have a good one.
Seattle Seahawks.